This is Mauritius, an island paradise east of Madagascar. People come here for pristine beaches, delicious food, vibrant culture, and this goofy-looking bird, the dodo. The dodo is the island's mascot. It's on their money, on their passports, their postage stamps, on their rum. Mauritius is the land of the dodo, a bird that is famously extinct. And no, the dodo didn't go extinct because it was chasing after melons in the Ice Age. And it also didn't go extinct because it was stupid. The dodo went extinct because it had lived undisturbed in an island paradise for ages without the need for any survival instincts, until it came into contact with the most dangerous animal on earth, humans. So even if you made the trek to Mauritius, you wouldn't be able to meet its mascot face to face. It's a testament to our ability as a species to wipe out another species without even trying. Right now we're in danger of doing it all over again. Let me introduce you to another bird making waves in its local area. This is Cape Town, an adventurer's paradise, and it's right here at the tip of Africa. This is Cape Town's mascot, the African penguin. They like to eat fish, they're really good at swimming, they're monogamous, they have these cute little spots, and they're absolutely adorable. And if you ever want to meet one of these cute little guys in the wild, you're running out of time. This is the Whip, a secluded beach on the south coast of South Africa that's protected inside a nature reserve. And these are African penguins, or at least they are statues of African penguins. These are penguin decoys locked in different penguin activities. If you could stand on this beach, you'd hear this. Sounds of African penguins doing penguin things. This isn't some kind of art project or some kind of open-air museum. These decoys are here to convince living, breathing penguins to come build their nests here, to make this beach their home. Because if they don't, just like the dodo, they might not survive. Look at this map of where all the penguins in the world live. You can see it's basically Antarctica and these little stretches of Southern Ocean coastline. You've probably heard of the OGs in Antarctica, the hefty emperor penguin and scrappy Adelie penguins. South America's coastline and neighboring islands feature the most penguin species: king, gentoo, chinstrap, rockhopper, Humboldt, Magellanic, all the way to the Galapagos penguin. The only penguin that managed to find a home north of the equator, just barely. Australia and New Zealand feature the Fiordland, Royal, Yellow-eyed and Snares penguins, and also this little guy, the little penguin, also known as the blue or fairy penguin. I might sound like a traitor here, but I think this one's my favorite. Then we have Africa.
African penguins are actually the only penguin species on the African continent. So there are some other penguin species on islands in the kind of Southern Ocean that kind of officially belong to South Africa, but the African penguin is the only real African penguin. They obviously play an important role in the ecosystem. So they're part of a very diverse ecosystem, the Benguela upwelling system, where we have cold water coming along the warm coast of Southern Africa. We have lots of plankton, we have lots of fish, we have lots of birds, lots of seabirds, whales, dolphins, and they just play a key role in this system, and they're just amazing species.
African penguins spend most of their lives at sea looking for fish. They can swim up to 100 kilometers a day, and they fall asleep in the ocean, bobbing up and down in the waves. They only come to the shore to do two things: molt and breed. Molting is when the penguins shed and replenish their feathers. They spend a long time fattening up, and then for 3 weeks they can't go into the ocean as they wait for their feathers to come back and their waterproofing to be reinstalled. When the time comes to breed, penguins will choose a colony, pair up, dig out a nest, lay a pair of eggs, and then work together to raise the chicks. The parents will work together to guard the nest and forage, and then once the chicks are big enough, both parents will go out to find food while the chicks organize themselves in a kind of creche to protect themselves. After a couple of months, the young penguins will leave their nests and go to fish for themselves.
When they're ready and kind of grown up enough to be able to survive on their own, they leave their colony and spend the next 3 to 6 years at sea. They hardly ever come to land. They're just out in the ocean finding food, and we think kind of looking around at various different colonies and seeing what's available.
So these guys are basically Cape Town's mascots. You'll see them on every travel ad, in tons of Instagram pictures. You get them on t-shirts, toys, underwear, statues, postcards. They even have their own dating show on Netflix. So the best place to see these penguins is in my hometown. And if you've done any bit of research or you've done our Cape Town course, you'll know that the very best place is at Boulders Beach in Simonstown. At Boulders, there's always a buzz on the beach surrounding these little guys. The sunbathers, blue waters, clear skies, all paint a picture of penguin paradise. But the thing is, this isn't a paradise. In fact, it's actually more of a penguin refugee camp.
In 2009 to 2010, the IUCN, which monitors the conservation status of basically all the species on Earth, uplisted the penguin to endangered. And that brings it into a kind of higher threat category, a greater risk of extinction.
That risk is actually quite real. So there is some calculation that say that the penguin could go extinct within the next 15 to 30 years.
Here is a graph of penguin populations since 1910. 100 years ago, the global estimate was about 1.5 million penguins. And today that number is down to 18,000. You don't have to be a mathematician to see what's going on here. African penguins are at a serious risk of going extinct. Cape Town's most iconic animal, gone. More specifically, functionally extinct. Penguins are really good at breeding in captivity, so while you might still be able to see them in zoos, the world's oceans will be completely devoid of African penguins.
There have obviously always been species that have gone extinct and others have developed, so that's obviously a natural process. But the current rate of species going extinct is definitely influenced by human behavior.
If we go back in time, we can get a picture of what's been killing them off so quickly. Let's go back all the way to the 1800s. Back then, penguins exclusively bred on islands where there were less predators and better access to fish.
Historically, penguins have bred on coastal islands because they naturally don't have any terrestrial predators, and penguins, being unable to fly, are quite vulnerable.
It's estimated that there were 4 million penguins off the coast of South Africa and Namibia. The capital city for penguin life was here, on Dussin Island. In 1910, this island was home to over 1 million penguins. In the nearby coastal town of Azefontein, there are stories of penguin feathers washing up on the beach so numerously that people could just go pick up the feathers and use them to stuff their pillows and jackets. But even living on islands, a penguin's life isn't easy. They are prime targets for ocean predators like seals and sharks, and even other birds like petrels and gulls. The penguin's main survival strategies are hanging out in large groups and being really good at swimming. It doesn't sound like much, but it's kept the food chain playing field pretty even for a very long time. Another survival trick that the penguins have at their disposal is guano, which is a fancy word for bird poop. Years of living undisturbed on their own private rock has created the perfect ecosystem for penguins to dig their nests into, as layers and layers of guano were deposited over time. So we have a massive colony of penguins living happily on their stinky island paradise, making babies and doing the bit for the ecosystem, until humans arrive. This is Jan van Riebeeck, the guy who famously founded Cape Town on behalf of the Dutch East India Trading Company in 1652. 2 years after landing on the Cape, he decided that seal fur would be one of the colony's hottest exports. So he started sending sealers to the penguins' island. When they landed there, they named it Dussin Island, after the hordes of dussies that also coexisted with the penguins on the island. The sealers hunted seals for their fur and meat, but then also penguins.
They ate the eggs. I think they also ate the penguins themselves, but then they also boiled them down for fat to use in lights and all sorts of things. That caused the first really rapid decrease in penguin numbers just because humans were killing them.
So Dussin Island very quickly went from being a penguin paradise to a penguin killing field. As the penguin numbers started dwindling, sailors brought in tortoises and rabbits to provide a food source for shipwreck survivors, bringing imbalance to an ecosystem that had been stable for ages. And the invasion of Dawson Island didn't stop there. In the mid-1840s, sailors and merchants turned their attention to the layers and layers of precious penguin poop that covered the island to use as fertilizer. Demand for guano had boomed all over the world, and boatloads of guano scrapers descended onto the island to hack away at the penguins' nest-building material.
There were actually fights over who owned the islands and who had the rights to harvest all this really good fertilizer.
Taking the guano actually meant that there was a lot of disturbance, so birds couldn't breed peacefully because there were people shoveling their poo away. And also the penguins used to make their burrows basically in their own poo inside the guano. And now they had to breed exposed to the environment. That means they're more exposed to the sun, to storms, to rain, also to predators like kelp gulls.
Guano is not a fast replenishing resource, so pretty soon the island had been scraped bare. But that didn't mean that people left the island alone for the penguins to recover. By the 1870s, global demand for penguin eggs was at an all-time high. The old guano scrapers' quarters was turned into egg snatchers' dorms, and for the next century, penguin eggs found their way onto breakfast tables around the world. South African Parliament even had penguin eggs on the breakfast menu up until 1960. It's estimated that between 1900 and 1930, 13 million eggs were collected. Around the same time, Cherry Kearton made a trip to Dawson Island. Cherry Kearton and his brother Richard are considered the fathers of modern wildlife documentaries. Cherry found out about the island after being offered penguin eggs for breakfast. After 4 perilous sailing attempts, he finally made it to the island. And then years later came back with his wife to spend 4 months on the island to study the penguins. He ended up writing this book and made a film called The Sun, an adventure in search of laughter, featuring nature's greatest little comedians. This was a massive hit in bioscopes all around the world. This movie, by the way, is allegedly the first nature documentary that David Attenborough ever saw, and is what convinced him to get into nature documentaries himself. So let's just take a moment to appreciate this footage. This footage shows just how many penguins was on this island. This was taken after people had started collecting eggs and killing penguins on the island, so there used to be even more than this. To me, the most penguins I've ever seen was at Stony Point in Betty's Bay, which is a colony of about 2,000 penguins. Seeing this footage blew my mind. Even though there were over 1 million penguins on the island when Kearton was there, he still expressed his concern about how fast the population was dropping. And that was a trend that was only accelerating. 40 years later, a new threat emerged when the Suez Canal was closed in 1967. More and more foreign tankers had to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, and with the increased traffic came oil spills. Every day, birds were washing up on Cape Town's beaches covered in oil. One lady, Althea Westphal, took it upon herself to do something about it. She started collecting these birds and taking them to her backyard in Claremont to clean them. She would do this for years, by hand cleaning and feeding the penguins and driving them 30 kilometers twice a week to go swim in a tidal pool. In 1968, she gathered enough funding to start SANCCOB, the South African Foundation for the Conservation of Coastal Birds. After years and years of studying African penguins, she got a permit to go to Dawson Island to monitor the population there. In 1969, at a conference in Kruger National Park, she put up a photo that she took on the island with one that Cherry Kearton took on the island in 1930. The contrast between the two photos made it very clear that the penguin population had been ravaged, and it convinced the South African government to ban the collection of penguin eggs. In 1987, Dawson Island was officially made a nature reserve and has been managed by Cape Nature ever since. Since then, human presence on the island has been bare minimum, only for research and conservation purposes. So finally, it seems like the penguins caught a break. But with a new century comes new problems for the African penguin. When I was a kid, the first thing that came to my mind if you spoke about penguins was this.
The unseasonably calm weather could hardly have hinted at the environmental disaster which was about to shatter the winter respite of this fairest cape.
In 2000, a large tanker carrying iron ore from China to Brazil sunk 10 kilometers off the coast of Cape Town. The resulting oil spill threatened to take out almost the entire penguin population. 2,000 tons of oil was moving between Robben and Dawson Island and affected around 40,000 penguins. When penguins come in contact with an oil spill, the oil clamps to their feathers and it ruins their ability to keep themselves warm. They have to swim out onto the beach where they face dehydration and imminent starvation. And I know you're asking, how do they get dehydrated on the beach? Penguins actually don't drink fresh water, they drink seawater and then sneeze out the salt. This situation can also lead to blood loss, ulcers and anemia. This event had a massive effect on the psyche of Cape Townians. The photos of thousands of penguins covered in oil spurred the largest animal rescue effort in history. Under Sankop's leadership, 45,000 volunteers cleaned 20,000 penguins by hand. They had entire warehouses filled with penguin cleaning pools. It takes 2 volunteers about an hour to clean 1 penguin. Penguins don't know how to eat fish that don't swim, so every penguin has to be force-fed by hand as well. Once all the penguins had been cleaned, they were sent in boxes to the beach where they were re-released into the wild. The 2000 oil spill marks a turning point in our attitudes towards the African penguins. No longer were they seen as commodities to be exploited, but as animals that are a part of our heritage, wildlife that needs to be protected. Today, the African penguin is synonymous with Cape Town, a perfect mascot for a city that's filled with adventurers, beachgoers, and nature lovers. Yet, despite our changed attitudes, penguin numbers have continued to drop.
So basically, we always say there were 40,000 African penguins affected in the treasure oil spill. We currently have probably about 40,000 penguins left in the wild globally. So I always joke there will never be such a huge disaster like the treasure because there aren't as many birds around anymore, but that's obviously kind of a sad statistic.
And that's because the fate of the African penguin is tied to the fate of another ocean dweller, the sardine. Sardines are a crucial part of South Africa's marine ecosystem. South Africa is home to the sardine run, a migration event that rivals the great wildebeest migration of East Africa in terms of biomass. When conditions are right, massive shoals of sardine move along the south and west coast, causing feeding frenzies wherever they go. The entire marine ecosystem relies on small fish like these to bridge the energy gap between algae, plankton, and then the larger fish that eat these sardines. Penguins in particular will not survive without sardines.
There's a very tight coupling between the penguin population and the fish numbers. So if you put a graph together with fish numbers and penguin numbers, they kind of follow each other very, very closely. And that's because the penguins almost exclusively eat those fish. So if there's no fish, the penguins' breeding success is much lower and their survival is much lower.
Sardine movements and populations are not very well understood yet, but there are a few things that we do know. And when you put everything together, the picture becomes very interesting.
These are pelagic fish, so it means they live kind of in the water column and they actually move a lot. So they have this very intriguing kind of migrating pattern or movement patterns. They move to kind of the southern tip of Africa to spawn, so that's when they lay their eggs. Then the eggs kind of drift with the current northwards along the coast, and then the young little fish kind of start coming down again. The timing and the location of where penguins are breeding would have been linked kind of to that system. So obviously it would have evolved that by the time the fish come past the colony, that is when the birds have their chicks, and that's when they have access to lots of fish.
In 1940, a handful of fisheries opened on the west coast of South Africa, particularly here in Saldanha Bay. These fisheries started out small at first, but very soon became massive industrial operations. In 1960, the annual sardine catch was 400,000 tons. Fish became South Africa's largest food export, and the country ranked 8th in the world for largest exporter of fish. But the 1960 catch turned out to be as good as it was going to get. Within a decade, the fish population had crashed, and by 1970, the annual catch was 40,000 tons, 10 times less than what it used to be. And this is where the relationship between penguins and sardines becomes very apparent.
Currently, the other problem with the fish is that the sardine abundance now is really low, and it has been for the last 3 years. And we don't know why that is. It's probably a combination of environment and fishing pressure.
It was first believed that actually the fish from the west coast has moved eastward. It is now more believed that it's two different stocks, that it's kind of two different groups. But because of changes in the environment, sea temperatures, those things, and the very heavy fishing pressure on the west coast in these areas, this west coast stock has basically collapsed. So there is very, very little fish now along the west coast. There is now more fish along the south coast, so basically around the tip of Africa and a little bit going east. But the penguins don't decide from one year to the other, oh, we just follow the fish, let's just move somewhere else. Once they've started breeding on one colony, they usually stick to that colony for the rest of their life.
Remember Boulder Beach, Cape Town's penguin paradise? This colony, along with Stony Point and Betty's Bay, only started in 1982, after the fish stocks had collapsed. These penguins came south in search of fish, and for the first time started making nests on the mainland. Their island mentality is apparent by the fact that they are completely unequipped to deal with mainland predators. They fail to see humans, dogs, caracals as threats. Since the crash in the 80s, the government has tried to mitigate the sardine situation by doing acoustic surveys of sardine populations and allocating catch restrictions to different fishing companies. This helped until 2002, when for some reason sardine stocks started to decline again, and with it, the penguin population. Today, the largest penguin colony is here in Algoa Bay, 750 kilometers east of Cape Town. These penguins are having a much better time at finding food in the ocean, but this isn't an ideal breeding ground.
So Algoa Bay holds currently about 1/3 of the global penguin population, so the largest penguin and Cape Gannet colonies are located in Algoa Bay. Algoa Bay is also our home of Kucha Harbour, so the big industrial harbour that has been developed over the last recent years. And to be able to bring in bigger ships into the bay, they have now started to refuel at sea. So they basically have a floating filling station. So the big ship that has lots of oil, another ship comes, they put a pipe across and they refuel at sea. Ideally, that should only be done when the sea is flat. Ideally, that should only be done during the day. Ideally, it should be well monitored. There's people on standby to react if there's a spill. Unfortunately, since it was started in 2016, we already had 3 oil spills that affected endangered African penguins and endangered Cape Gannets. We know there has been a lot more oil going into the ocean that we haven't been informed about. So it is basically an ongoing threat. Sadly enough, all these 3 spills were linked to basically human error.
Seeing how serious the connection is between sardine stocks and penguin populations, seabird scientists like those at SANCOB and BirdLife South Africa started doing urgent research to prove this connection. Since 2006, these scientists have been advocating for fishing closures. In 2008, the government started experimenting with closing fishing grounds around 4 islands: Dussin Island and Robben Island on the west coast, and St. Croix and Bird Island on the east. And the results were clear. Fisheries have a definite impact on penguins' food availability.
In some of the ways that we are trying to advocate is certain closures, both in space and time. So there's certain areas that we know are very important for African penguins and other marine organisms to feed on. So if we can stop fishing in those areas, we hope that the birds will be able to find more food, but also it could create kind of refuge for fish to also, for the stocks to recover. And then there's obviously certain times of the year when this is important. So we're not saying, we want to close the fisheries completely. We're just wanting to kind of limit fishing in certain areas, but also hopefully reduce the pressure on the fish stock.
From 11 years of data, the seabird scientists found that just by closing fishing grounds 20 kilometers around these islands would be enough to help the penguin populations recover. That seems simple, right? They're not asking for a ban on fishing, just a ban on fishing around these islands. But for some reason, the fishing sector isn't cooperating. For almost 14 years, these seabird scientists and scientists at the Department of Fisheries have been locked in a war of debate over methods and interpretation of data. This disagreement has halted progress towards policy changes that would help save South Africa's marine ecosystem. On the one hand, fisheries say that if they were to close the areas around these islands, it would cost around $30 million a year. However, Boulders Beach alone brings in around $19 million annually, and over 500,000 international tourists visit this beach each year, hoping to hang out with these little guys in person. But more than any economic argument, doesn't it benefit everyone if the sardine stocks recover? Some of these South African fishing companies have to import sardines from Morocco because there's not enough here to meet demands. Add to that problems of corruption and infighting within the fishing sector, and foreign vessels coming to poach our already depleted fish stocks, and the problem seems insurmountable. To top that all off, climate change is messing with sardines' ability to spawn and breed, and people have been noting that sardine runs haven't been happening as frequently. As a Cape Towndian, I don't want to see my city's mascot, nature's greatest little comedian, die out. And the same goes for thousands of others. At Sandkop, the team is doing their best to make sure as many seabirds survive as possible.
Sandkop was started as basically an oil spill response organization. So we would respond to an oil spill, we would clean the birds, we release them back into the wild. But as the numbers of birds declined, it became more apparent that we need to do more. Some of the kind of earlier oil spills, the main focus was on adult penguins, because a penguin can live over 20 years, they breed every year. So in a long-lived species, saving an adult is much more important than saving a chick, because that adult will produce many more chicks. As the numbers declined, we realized, no, we also need to save these chicks if we want to save the species. So since the kind of mid-2000s, Sandkop has started to admit African penguin chicks. And since 2012, we've also started to admit penguin eggs, so we can actually incubate eggs. And we've now admitted almost 10,000 African penguin chicks, of which we've released probably 85% back into the wild. So it's a huge number. It is a lot of work. But now over the years, with all the data that we've collected by marking these chicks with microchips, we actually know they do survive and they do start breeding as well. But we kind of want to be more proactive. So we want to make sure these birds can actually breed perfectly in the wild, because we do believe if they do it in the wild, it's the best.
Along with a network of rangers and researchers, they keep track of how many birds are at each colony, how well they're eating, and if they are breeding successfully. Meanwhile, Christina is hoping that her hard work would pay off, and that the whip would become a safe haven for these penguins, where they can breed and hunt successfully.
We started working at De Hoop in 2018. The penguins actually tried to start breeding there in the mid-2000s, and unfortunately predation caused them to abandon the colony. They're very vulnerable to predation by leopard and caracal when they're breeding on the mainland. So what we have done is put up a predator-proof fence so that the area is now safe and fenced off, and we're trying to trick the penguins into thinking there's already a colony there. One thing that made us choose De Hoop, other than the fact that the penguins had tried to breed there before, was that we've seen through the fish surveys that there's always a good abundance of fish in that area. And also we have put GPS trackers on penguins from Dawson Island on the west coast, and we've found that when they're kind of finished breeding and need to fatten up again, they go from the west coast all the way down and round and forage around De Hoop. The first phase is the decoys. Decoys have never been used to try and attract African penguins. Decoys have been used for a number of other seabirds around the world, but they've mostly been flying birds. So we didn't know that if this was going to work. Because they are swimming, penguins have a much smaller field of view than a bird up in the air would have. So their detection range of a colony is probably a lot lower. And the second phase is releasing penguins at the colony site and hoping that they come back when they're ready to breed. That is still going to take another few years before we see any results for that. The lessons that we've learned from other seabird colony establishments is that it is a long-term project, so the sooner you start, the sooner you can hopefully get some results.
For these birds, time is running out. Unless we do something, there will come a day where there are no more African penguins in the ocean. The good news is, we can do something. Climate change and overfishing are both things that we can influence by our decisions. From the way we buy our food to the policies we choose to enact. We just need to make better decisions faster. In the meantime, if you're hoping to see one of these guys in person, you should come to Cape Town as soon as you can. I learned so much while making this video, especially from the guys at Sandcob and BirdLife South Africa. If you would like to support the work they're doing, check out the links in the description. You can support them either financially by becoming a volunteer, or you could even adopt a penguin and name one of the little waddlers out in the Southern Ocean. Thanks so much to everyone who's helped me with the research for this video, and thank you for watching this video.